Hello, welcome back to Altitude. My name is Ady Dolan. I'm an air traffic controller at Heathrow Airport, and I'm delighted to be in the host seat today, particularly for the subject that we're going to be talking about. Occasionally, something comes along that requires the aviation industry to show just how flexible and dynamic it can be. What we're here to talk about today is absolutely one of those occasions. In September last year, Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II died after more than 70 years on the throne. I know that we've got lots of viewers and listeners from around the world, but I hope that people will appreciate just quite how much of a huge and historic moment this was, especially for us here in the UK. With the nation in mourning, the response was critical. How do you maintain a service at Heathrow Airport, an essential part of UK infrastructure, whilst also ensuring that a state funeral can be totally free of overflying aircraft noise? It wasn't immediately clear how we were going to do it, whether it was even possible, with hundreds of flights scheduled to arrive and depart on that day. What followed were 10 days of incredibly intense preparation as we worked around the clock with airport and airlines to finalise a plan which had been developed for years as part of a wider plan codenamed Operation London Bridge, and execute one of the most complex and intricate civil traffic operations in decades. There are no two better people to help me tell that story than Kathryn Leahy, who was then Director of Operations at Heathrow Airport, now Team Heathrow Director, and Pete Glass, the General Manager of Air Traffic Services at Heathrow, who therefore also happens to be my boss. Firstly, hello, Kathryn. Welcome to Altitude.
Hi, Ady, and hi, everybody who's listening and watching in today.
Thank you. And also a big hello to you too, Pete.
Thanks, Ady. Hello, all.
So Kathryn and Pete, us three were all pretty heavily involved in that week, and it's certainly something that will live long in my memory. I'd been involved in the planning side of London Bridge for almost a decade beforehand, and we had a set of procedures that were fairly mature. And then we had the Duke of Edinburgh's funeral at Windsor, which was an opportunity for us to try the procedures, albeit in a COVID environment. Kathryn, that generated some lesson learning for us, didn't it, on perhaps maybe the need for us to go a little bit further with our London Bridge plans?
It did. And I think with the sad passing of the Duke of Edinburgh, it was a time when we were really in our third lockdown still of COVID. So the plan for the Duke actually didn't materialise in the way that it was written down. And if you remember the really poignant picture of Her Majesty standing alone in the pew at his funeral, well, when the Duke of Edinburgh sadly passed, we were very much a different size and shape of airport because we were still coming out of the pandemic. So there was much fewer flights, much fewer passengers, and just not the complexity. And it was really interesting, and I'm sure you'll remember, Ady, just the fact that actually the plan was scaled back so significantly from what we had actually thought it was going to be. And we'd also sort of planned in our mind, given that he was slightly older than Her Majesty, that he would probably go first, and therefore his plan would be a really good dry run of what we would have to do for Her Majesty. But it didn't materialise like that. It was totally different. It was still very poignant. We still had lots of work to do. But my goodness, it did not sort of have any bearing on what we delivered for Her Majesty's plan.
Absolutely, yeah. And if you recall, what we got a sight of as well is in those events where you've got obviously the noted national 2-minute silences, there are also other parts of the event that aren't necessarily notified as silent periods, but they are just absolutely silent. And there is no other noise. There's no ambient noise of road traffic or humans moving around. And so you have to be really careful with your flight paths and where you put aircraft, because that will cut through that silence.
Oh, I mean, it was incredible when you think about just the sort of size and scale of the procession and of the the celebration of our life, both in central London and in Windsor. You know, the complexities around that, and anybody who knows Heathrow knows that that is our flight path. We either come in along the river adjacent to Buckingham Palace, or we come in over Windsor. So there was so much need. Everybody wanted to hear the service. The streets were lined with people. There was screens up in parks. Everybody was wanting to pay their respects, and we had to do the same with the planning.
Yeah,
but
so
the general public flying as well.
absolutely, yeah, very, very difficult balance to get right. And Pete, where did the concept come from to try to avoid aircraft noise during the day of the funeral, like all aircraft noise? And was it something that was supported industry wide?
So we've had a plan that we've maintained, a bit like Kathryn was talking about, and that we also used the Duke of Edinburgh as a test bed for, so the London Bridge plan. So we had a bit of a base to start with, but it was clear when the Duke of Edinburgh sadly passed away that we needed to refine it, we needed to go a bit further. So we were looking at different options about how we could provide noise respite, the length of time that it needed to be provided for, balancing that against the impact to the flying public, because of course there's hundreds of plus thousands of people due to fly that day, and we wanted to make sure as many of them that could safely fly still. And we were working with Heathrow Airport, with the key airlines, with lots of external agencies to try and almost test and refine, and it became very iterative. So we started off with quite a bold plan that had lots of noise respite within it that would avoid large swathes of the funeral. But then as we understood better parts of the funeral, for example, the bit from Buckingham Palace to Westminster Abbey, there was a discussion over, how much do we need to protect that area? Well, once we found out that there was bands playing and there was bagpipes playing and there was going to be cannons going off, well, actually, it became really clear to us that aircraft noise was probably not going to be quite as critical to that element. So we were able to refine it down and say, okay, we don't need to disrupt that leg, and then preserve the respite potentially for the areas that had more of a significance. And over time, probably from the 5 days since the Queen sadly passed away, we sort of refined the plan as it stood, sort of as of day zero, into what the framework looked like about sort of 5 days in, so 5 days before the funeral, and then sort of built on it as our understanding became better as the days got closer. But it was certainly it took a lot of time, a lot of effort, and a lot of coordination with a lot of other agencies to end up with the plan that we enacted on the day.
Yeah, I remember very well an awful lot of conversations with lots of different people that week. And Kathryn, I reckon that, honestly, with the complexity of the plan that we were going with, in the airspace that we've got, some international airports might have just have said, you know what, we're just going to close. Is that something that you considered? And when did you decide that it wasn't necessary?
I guess from the beginning, we had planned it not to be necessary, because I'm actually the third operations director who's owned the plan, and I feel very privileged to have been the one that got to actually execute both plans. But we'd always imagined that we would have to keep the gateway to the UK open, and that's very much what we did, whilst also obviously respecting the solemnity of the moment in time. And of course, for me, it was even more solemn, given that we had had such a great celebration in June. It had been her platinum jubilee, and everybody had been hugely, we had attracted so many visitors to the UK for that event. And this was the next kind of, sort of milestone, and such a sad and poignant one. We worked really hard with NATS, you guys, with our airline partners, and about 400 companies across Heathrow to make sure that we kept the airport open, and we kept those who still had to go about their business, their family business, flying where they could. So it was really tricky, and I know we'll go to it, but my goodness, we have really benefited from a lot of the tools that over the last few years as an organisation, Heathrow has invested heavily in and have used heavily in. And I know, Pete, your team have really helped us implement what's called demand capacity balancing tool. We're one of the airports, major airports in Europe who uses ACDM for decision making. We're the only airport in the UK that uses it, and the DCB tool, the demand capacity balancing tool, was absolutely imperative for use on that day. And Pete, I don't know if you want to say a bit more about what we had to do to bring that to plan to life.
Yeah, so as Kathryn was saying, we're quite lucky in one sense at Heathrow that it's invested so much time and effort over the last sort of 5-10 years of building up a maturity of ACDM and how we share information, and we work across the airport in partnership to make sure we deliver on the day. And over the last few years, we've worked together to deliver the DCB tool, which is sort of a digital twin, and effectively it's a computer software program that takes the schedule inputs, it takes MET inputs, and we put in any operational restrictions or the runways in use for that day, and effectively it runs the schedule in its software, and it will tell us what the impact is, what the holding will be, if there's any night jet flights that day. And the level of maturity that Heathrow has now means that actually we've got a lot of confidence in that plan. So as our plan for the funeral became more mature and we kind of understand, what we started to do was then run that through DCB. And the tool's really quick. We could effectively put in the operating restrictions. So it sounds really simple, but for something like the 2-minute silence that was planned at a specific time, we planned for a 22-minute stop in arrivals to allow us to have effectively the ones on final approach to land, the period of silence, and so it's not just as simple as stopping for 2 minutes. So all those rules and periods were then put into DCB, and that then told us from a scheduling point of view what was possible, what we thought could be delivered, or we could then make recommendations to Heathrow Airport about how they might want to reduce or restrict, or if we amended the schedule by an hour this way, the effect on night movements was this, so we'd have to cancel this more. And it was an ongoing balancing act to try and get the final output and the final plan that we then pressed go on and submitted.
Fabulous. So, I mean, you've got all these fantastic plans. We've worked really hard to deliver something, to develop something, and then we get to the actual day itself. So, I suppose that the first thing we needed to do was to restrict overflights in the area around Westminster Abbey. Now, Pete, that's an area which is overflown every few minutes normally on a day as aircraft fly on a base leg towards Heathrow. How did Heathrow approach controllers avoid that patch of airspace on the day?
So from a procedure point of view, effectively we draw a radius, a circle around Westminster Abbey, 2.5 mile radius, Westminster Abbey centred in the middle, and down on the radar screens where the approach controllers are working, we effectively put that on the radar so the controllers can see the area, and then they're required effectively to vector planes around it. Now, that sounds really easy, but for anyone who looks at the maps of Heathrow approach, the radar manoeuvring area is really complicated, really complex, and we'll have, up to 20 planes at any one time that are being sequenced on, often in the stacks and onto final approach. So it's actually a really complicated job for controllers to amend their standard vectoring plans and miss a 2.5 mile radius area. And it was great work from the approach controllers down at Swanwick, who successfully did that for most of the day without impacting on the landing rate at Heathrow, because of course if you don't land the right number of planes, that then impacted on our overall plan and things would be delayed. So something as simple as a 2.5 mile circle still had a lot of effort and requirement to go on.
Absolutely, yeah. And then we built on towards the 2-minute silence, which was a tricky one for us, because normally things like that, which happen on maybe Remembrance Sunday, are at a set time, whereas on this occasion it was decided to have that 2-minute silence at the end of the ceremony, which did have a bit of flex as to when that was going to be. So we had to build a buffer either side of that. And as you said, Pete, we needed to kind of make that period quite lengthy so that other people on the ground, not necessarily just those in and around Westminster Abbey, could peacefully observe that moment of silence. But Kathryn, how was that covered at the airport? Because you've still got stuff going on at an airport, and aircraft moving around and people moving around in terminals. What happened about Heathrow?
Goodness, it was probably our part of the most nerve-wracking part of our plan, because we get a lot of feedback on Remembrance Sunday, which is a UK holiday. It is not a holiday for anybody else, about our 2-minute silence and the fact that we can't get all passengers to observe it because they're not Brits and that's not something that they recognise. So we did a huge amount of communications across the airport on that day. All of our media screens had portraits of Her Majesty on them. All of our television screens in the terminal were broadcasting the funeral. And we put out a lot of announcements that there would be a silence. We had people, when you said, Ady, a moment ago about, the silence over Westminster and that kind of being the start of the plan, for us, the plan started with the first shifts coming in the morning, because the road closure plans were such that we had to plan from the night before how we would get the first wave of all colleagues into the airport, whether it was airline colleagues, NATS colleagues, security colleagues at Heathrow. So our plan had started from kind of 12 hours before even the first set of arrivals had started to come in at 0400. And we had everybody poised and ready for the silence. All of our teams were wearing either black armbands or black ties. Everybody came out in appropriate, what we would say appropriate dress attire for the solemnity of the occasion. And it was quite amazing to see. We stopped everything. We had got all of our ground handlers, our airlines, and everybody in the terminals to agree to stop the entire check-in process. So if they were serving somebody 30 seconds before the silence started, they said, sorry, we're going to have to stop checking you in. We want complete silence. And some of the footage we have in the terminals of that day is really, poignant and really breathtaking. Everybody stopped and took the 2 minutes and really reflected, because while she was our queen, she was just such an international superstar. I know that's an odd way to describe her, but she really, really was. And we, outside the airport and on the ramp, we've been talking a lot about air traffic control, but just air traffic movements on the ground. We also had the process, and you guys at NATS were really pivotal in doing this. We had all of the ground handlers poised and ready to go as well. We put out alerts across our radio channel call, so we've got an ability to call everybody in the radio, and we gave them a 30-second warning and everything stopped. There was no aircraft moving, there was no baggage tugs driving about. The entire airport came to a standstill. And apart from volcanic ash, and I don't think we have ever seen that at the airport.
Yeah, I agree. It was absolutely surreal. Just to see aircraft stopped on taxiways for the entire period was something which I'll not forget. But what happened in the tower? We should be able to queue up a quick video that we can show you, and probably start by saying that we were very fortunate to have some really exceptional teams working with us, both at NATS and at HAL, in the tower and at the terminal control at Swanwick. All the operational teams received face-to-face briefings because of the complexity of the event. This was a complete one-off, and we had dedicated London Bridge coordinator positions at both the tower and terminal control. I often get asked, how did we track the procession once it started? Well, we had 3 ways. Firstly, we devised a waypoint log for the procession. We knew the start point, Wellington Arch. We knew the end at Windsor Castle. And we knew the start and the end times, and we knew the distance. So therefore, we could calculate that the speed was going to be roughly 12 miles an hour. So if you're familiar with London, that enabled us to pick out some key waypoints along the way, along the lines of the Natural History Museum, Hammersmith Flyover, Chiswick Roundabout, to name but a few. And secondly, we share that information with the pilot of the media helicopter who was providing the pooled pictures to the world, who was able to tell us via radio to the controllers in the tower precisely when the procession reached those waypoints. And that enabled us to figure out whether or not our our waypoint log was ahead or behind of schedule. And thirdly, as a final check, we set up BBC iPlayer, a streaming service in the UK, on a separate screen in the control tower, and calculated the streaming delay against live broadcast, so that we could use that as a live cross check against our timings. And we knew that it was something that we were only ever going to get one shot at, which is why we spent such a huge amount of time getting it right. Getting it wrong would obviously have been catastrophic. So Pete, the question I suppose is, did anything go wrong? Was there anything that you weren't quite expecting?
Thanks, Ady. You always spend an incredible amount of time planning for these events, and there's a phrase that Kathryn knows, is about the unknowns. They're the things that keep you awake at night. They're what you worry about, because I know the teams have put everything in and we come up with a really robust plan, but there's always a few curveballs that happen on a day. I think overall I look at the plan and I think we delivered it really successfully, but there were definitely a few nervy moments along the way. Just around about the operational, the 2-minute silence, we had a very short period where we thought for operational reasons we might have a problem with one of our runways. It turned out not to be an event at the time, but for 5 minutes you're starting to think, crumbs, if you take away one of my runways, that's going to be a bad day and I'm not sure the plan will stand up. Thankfully that didn't come into play and we were okay. But you mentioned about the helicopter and the timings. Obviously, when we were working it out, we just assumed that the Queen procession would go on an average speed and would work its way along the route. Now, we quite quickly realised that in central London, with lots of people there to line the route, it was going slower at the start. So I think quite quickly, the time that we thought that the procession was going to go, I think at one point it was about 25 minutes late. And then you start to worry and think, well, if it stays 25 minutes late, that means all our timings, which are fixed, if you think how long it takes to plan, the stoppages and put flow on to make sure that aircraft are arriving ready for when we're opening up again, we can't really afford to be 25 minutes late, because that's 25 minutes of holding, that's probably diversions, and that's going to really impact our ability to deliver the plan. So I think for about 10 or 15 minutes, I was sitting in the tower probably talking to you going, oh, this isn't great. I don't know what's going to go now. And then I think what we found out is actually it was sorry, Kathryn.
One blessing though, the weather was really kind to us. I mean, the three of us are not generally that blessed, I would say, when it comes to operational. So in terms of the planning, I mean, we knew probably 4 days out through the forecast that we kind of could expect the sort of winds, and thank goodness, the Met Office, does the jobs that they do for us. But that would have been an absolute nightmare had all of a sudden there been a change in the direction of the wind. I don't know what we'd done. I think we'd have all just cried.
I certainly didn't want to have to deal with that. Thankfully, as the procession came out of London and the crowds thinned, I guess built into their plan was that it sped up. So I'm pretty sure by the time it arrived at the long walk, it was actually bang on schedule again. So the overall plan came together, but definitely there was a small period there when we were operating with the procession significantly behind time that I was wondering, is this going to impact on our part too?
Yeah, absolutely. And Kathryn, once we kind of got to that point, what was the impact on the terminals? Was passenger throughput still good? Were things running smoothly? Had the scheduling worked?
Absolutely. I mean, there was moments when you've got your sort of normal operational challenges that we kind of prepare for and we handle on a day-to-day basis, but we couldn't have asked for a better operational day than the day that we had. Everybody played their part. It was really it was actually a joy to kind of see everybody come together. And we generally come together as a community for big events. It doesn't always happen like that every single day, but it was passengers got away, passengers arrived. There was minimal, I would say, disruption in terms of the schedule. Everybody was very, very understanding of the kind of tweaks that they had to make and the accommodation of the silences. But thank the Lord, we had no major events. And I have been known in my career as Liability Leahy, so I was really glad that it went off without a hitch.
Pete, what was the final result on the schedule in terms of airfield performance? How did the airport cope with those stoppages that DCB had factored in?
I think from my point of view, I think the big credit is that we delivered the plan and we delivered the schedule. We delivered the schedule as predicted. So over the course of the day, Heathrow effectively made a schedule intervention of about 15% of what would have been planned to fly. And if you think when we first started developing the plan, at one point it looked like maybe we were going to be 60, 75% if we'd had to, have full respite for the full day. So it's really good, one, that we had the confidence to take out so minimal flights so that hopefully most of the people who were planned to fly that day did do. But for me, there was a couple of things. I think, one, there wasn't a diversion that was due at all to the Queen's funeral plan, so no one had to divert from away from the airport. There wasn't a night jet movement that day. That was a result of the Queen funeral plan, so that we delivered the schedule on time, and that we operated everyone who planned to land and fly in out of Heathrow Airport. Delays were within what DCB had predicted, and I think overall we were really pleased at the end of the day that we delivered to plan, and thankfully we didn't have any phone calls around aircraft noise. I think the best thing for us was that from a Heathrow Airport point of view or a NATS point of view, no one mentioned us. No one said, listen to that aircraft. No one said, oh, it's a shame about that aircraft flying over. And I think we were able to hopefully pay our respects in our way and deliver the plan successfully.
Wow. So we've all worked on interesting things in the past, like the Jubilee, presidential visits, Olympics. Where do you think it sits in terms of complexity, Kathryn? What do you reckon? Is it the most complicated thing that you've worked at Heathrow?
Oh goodness, it's definitely up there. I think just because of the number of moving parts that were taking place, and we had what I can only describe as a framework plan that pretty much got rewritten over the course of the 10 days. But I'm so proud of how the teams all came together. But it's definitely in my top three of probably my number one. I'll have to reflect on that, Ady, because there's been a few, but it's definitely my top three.
Pete, what about you in terms of air traffic at both the Tower and Swanwick and the interlink between the two? Is it one of the trickiest things you've worked on?
Oh, easily the most complex thing that I've delivered. Sometimes in ATC, we're lucky in the sense that we're insulated from the airport's problems, and they deal with a lot of problems in the terminal and in the environment that we just don't have to deal with because we're just on the ATC side of it. But this one for me was by far the most complicated and complex thing that we've had to organise. If you look at the amount of stakeholders that were going on, trying to balance paying our respects to the late Majesty versus trying to get our passengers to fly as much as we can. We're used to doing small bits of disruption for fly pasts or the memorial services, or we've had heads of states visit that have. But the length of time that this one went into, you can see from the video there, from about 8 o'clock in the morning to almost 8 p.m. at night, there was some form of operational restriction that the teams were working around. So to organise that in the space of 10 days, starting from what, like Kathryn said, a framework plan that looked frankly nothing like the end result plan by the time we built on it, deliver it, and then deliver it successfully as a team across us, I think definitely ranks as one of the most enjoyable things I've done in my life so far, and two, definitely the hardest and most complex.
Amazing. Kathryn, before we go to some questions, and we've got quite a few, I'm going to give you the last word. The industry was just recovering from the worst crisis in its entire history. In hindsight, do you think it was the right thing to do?
Absolutely. I think, the Queen has played a huge and really important part in Heathrow's history, and the admiration for her was at an all-time high. And when you think about the Queen, you think about how commercially savvy she was as well. So I'm pretty sure that, we absolutely did the right thing. The Queen stepped foot on British soil as our Queen in Heathrow when she returned from Kenya in 1952 after the death of her father. So her legacy at Heathrow goes so far back. The airport was only just nearly 10 years old at the time. So making sure that we did the right thing by her and by her legacy. Terminal 2 is called the Queen's Terminal, and it did her very proud that day.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you both for a really fascinating discussion. Let's now take some questions from the audience. First of all, we've got Robbie, who has asked, Pete, was the event ever practiced in simulators, or was it simply 10 days of preparation of written down plans?
So we do have a simulator based at the tower that we can use for certain elements of emergency training or controller training. But for this, no, we didn't go to the simulator because it almost wasn't. It wasn't teaching the controllers how to fly or how to avoid areas. It was about setting the procedures up. But it wasn't as much as just go to meetings and write down the plan. So I remember, I think it was 2 days before the funeral where, me and you and the whole of our ops team cleared out the office and we got out a huge whiteboard and we just stepped our way through the plan, what was going on, who needed to know, what the timings were, what the impact was, and we kind of just stepped our way through it all the way to make sure that we were comfortable that everything joined together. And then following that, you yourself led face-to-face briefings with all the teams. So everyone who was going to be on duty that day had a personal briefing. If they couldn't make the ones we organised in their days off in their own time, then we made sure they had a one-to-one briefing before they plugged in. So it was much more around making sure people were comfortable with the temporary procedures that we were putting in place and they worked, rather than the ability of controllers to control planes, because the fundamentals of how the aircraft were going to fly hadn't changed. So there wasn't a need this time to use a simulator.
Yeah, I remember the briefings were very, very extensive, and it was important that we gave face-to-face briefings for such a complicated event. But what was really great for me was all of the teams that were briefed were so focused and really desperate to do this well. They knew the importance of the event and they wanted to play their part. And everybody knew that there was going to be curveballs, things would be thrown up, and the flexibility and dynamism shown was fantastic on the day that everybody just rolled with things. The next question we've got is from James, who, Kathryn, I think you can probably pick this one up, about were the adjusted procedures ever at risk of not being implemented and reverting to normal ops? Or was it, well, once we got the plan, that was the plan?
We were never going to revert to normal ops. I don't think that any of us as a community and ecosystem at Heathrow would have wanted not to support not having the noise at the times that we did. So we were never going to revert to normal ops. We'd worked on this for so long. The plan was always to have periods of silence. It was just the length and the duration and the timings that we really didn't know or understand. And I think it was Pete, you said, at when the procession and everything started off, and when we got wind that there was going to be bagpipers and brass bands and everything, that meant that gave us the confidence that actually the plans that we created, the likelihood of the noise challenge, certainly in the central London end of it, was not going to cause any issue. If you remember, guys, that the private ceremony in Windsor at the very end of the day was probably our biggest challenge, where we were really keen to not have too much noise, and there was no surrounding noise. There was no pomp and ceremony taking place because it was a private ceremony, but having noise was never an option for us.
Excellent. Pete, here's a question from Aryan, who asks, what were the contingencies in place if an aircraft declared a mayday or a pan during the airspace closure?
Well, simply, it's the same as for any other operating day. So we have categories of emergency, and an emergency will always put a flight at a higher priority than a standard operating flight. And we were always clearing all our briefings that should an aircraft have a problem, should a mayday be declared, should an emergency be declared, and an aircraft wish to divert into Heathrow, that normal priorities take place. And emergency aircraft always have the number one priority. So they would have been vectored to land on the runway that was in use. And unfortunately, if that meant that it was in a period of silence, that would have meant it was in a period of silence. But when it comes to emergencies in flight, that safety is your number one priority. So as we would do for any other day, the airspace itself wasn't closed. We were just restricting the periods where we're going to try and operate. So an emergency would override those and we would have landed it safely.
Fab, thank you very much. Question for Kathryn is from Kate, who says, how differently would the planning have been without the technology tools like DCB to simulate the plan in advance?
Oh goodness, it would have been nearly impossible. In fact, it would have been impossible. We would have had to have used a very blunt instrument, which would have involved a lot more disruption to passengers and flight schedules. And it would have been a really big challenge to get that landed. And the overarching disruption that would have caused to the wider network for days after the event would have been huge. So it would have been horrendous. We probably wouldn't be having this conversation today. We'd probably be digging our way out of the inquiry as to why we had to cancel some flights and not others.
Yeah,
I can't remember it now, but I'm sure there used to be some sort of almost glorified Excel sheet, wasn't there, that we used to go through and sort of manually input, and then it would come out with a scary number on the bottom right.
Yeah. And then the computer said no, and you airline conversations, and people would want a bit more privacy than others. Oh yeah, it would have been a nightmare.
Absolutely. Question for Pete from Josh, who says, was there any consideration for overflying aircraft at higher altitudes? And he says, thank you very much for a great show.
Oh, thank you very much. So yes, is the answer. So we weren't just, although I'm focused at Heathrow Airport, as obviously the GM for air traffic service at Heathrow, we were considering the noise from a wider angle as part of the wider NATS effort. In the 2.5 mile radius that we talked about over Westminster Abbey, that wasn't just for Heathrow traffic, that was for all traffic, and went up to a specified height. I can't remember now exactly what it was. It might have been about 10,000 feet, but effectively a level where we were assured that if an aircraft overflies that, at a height that you wouldn't hear the noise underneath it. So yes, it was considered.
And the next question is from Paul, who asks, what was the impact on the other London airports? So I suppose this one is for Pete, but Kathryn, if you've got any intel, feel free to chip in.
Yeah, well, London City Airport was really heavily impacted, and my counterpart there, had similar challenges, but probably much smaller operation, but not dissimilar challenges and periods of closure as well. So we were exchanging notes throughout the build up to the day minus zero of the event.
Yeah, similar to Kathryn, I was in close contact with the general manager for NATS at London City. So it was effectively London City, ourselves, and Swanwick Terminal Control that were the key ATC parts of the cog that were then linking in with the airlines and airports.
Excellent. We've got a question here about the complexity of the plan. So Nick asks, what was the most complex operational hurdle that needed to be overcome? So Pete, do you want to go first?
For me, it's easy. It's the procession and the timings. I've still got somewhere a copy of that sheet, A4 sheet that you produced with an average 12 mile an hour, the duration, the length, and the 15 or 20 waypoints on the side, and Brentford Stadium we needed to stop landing, and the roundabout at which we needed to start vectoring around the police helicopter, and the Magna Carta at which we needed to stop departures, and then trying to work out that timing and fit the schedule into it. A moving car with a procession versus planes that are, taking off sometimes 5-6 hours away, 12-13 hours away for your long haul, and making sure all married up. And we didn't have aircraft arriving just as we'd stopped landing, therefore taking up so much time in the hold they had to divert and go somewhere else. I think joining that bit together was probably the most complex bit for me.
I'm impressed that you remember so much of the briefing, Pete. It was obviously a quality brief. Kathryn, what about you at the airport? What was the most complicated part for you?
Well, it's interesting because working with you guys, we knew that part of the plan was going to be in really safe hands, but we were also working with Transport for London, the Highways Agency, because of all of the road closures in central London and out to Windsor. So just when we thought we had the plan, and as Pete described all of the different stopping points, we were also concerned about, well, how are passengers going to get to the airport? How are crew going to get to the airport to fly these aircraft? Are we going to end up with delays, and then airlines wanting to hold flights because passengers haven't been able to get to the airport because they've been stuck in the procession? So once I knew that we had the air traffic control bit in the bag, we then started to really sort of focus on what were the road plans. And we had Heathrow community volunteers out litter picking along the journey and everything. And we actually had colleagues in the Transport for London cell who were sitting with the commissioner and deputy commissioner and making sure that the flow in and out of colleagues, passengers, support services were happening too. So I was on the ground and in the air in a
panic. Andrew's asked a really good question about lesson learning. You get these huge events, and it's important that we try and pull some of the lessons from them. He says, were there any key things that you learned that can be reused for other special operations or indeed just normal ops? Pete?
I guess I'd take two takeaways. One's the collaboration. I think very early we set up frameworks of governance, but across, we weren't just doing it as Heathrow Airport, we weren't just doing it as NATS, we weren't just doing it as NATS and Heathrow, we were doing it as the industry. And I think we set it up at different levels within our organisations, and I think that proved really to be effective as a flow in cascading of information and assurance on the plans and everyone's different perspective on it. And I think the other thing for me is it's just given me the reassurance that DCB does have that valuable insight into how we plan for a day and how we deliver a day. And okay, this was an extreme event and a very, very one side of it. But then if you look at other normal events, delivering the plan on a day-to-day basis, fog, if we have low visibilities or if we have any other special events, it's really given us the assurance that the work we've done on DCB is validated in the sense of what we delivered on the day was as it was predicted.
Okay, and then Kathryn, what about you? Any key learning points for yourself and the team at HAL?
For us, it's always about overall communication and how we can improve that, because, as Pete said, the collaboration is one thing, but how you get people communicated with, whether that was, airline chief execs, ground handling companies, so that everybody had one version of the truth. And that is always the biggest challenge when you're dealing with what's the equivalent of a mini city, at Heathrow. So communication, and bringing the right people and the decision makers into the room early is also really key and one of the big learnings.
Great stuff. Time for our final question, which is from Sam. With hindsight, what would you have done differently with regard to the final plan? So Pete, how would you have changed it?
I wouldn't have changed it. In an ideal world, I've had another 10 days just to develop it, so I didn't have to do it all within the 24 hours that was only allowed each day. But I think we delivered the plan well, and I think it worked well. So I don't look back and think I'd change any major part of it.
And Kathryn, last word to you.
I think similar to Pete, I don't think I would have changed anything. I think, as I said, the weather was kind to us. An old boss of mine, Norman Bovan, used to ask me on a regular basis what was my plan, B, C, D, E, F, and G. And I'm not sure that I would have got very far past B in this case. So I'm glad that everything went the way it did.
Yeah, that makes three of us. So, guys, I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today. Those of you watching and listening, I really hope you've enjoyed the show and it's given you a bit of an insight into a very special one-off event at Heathrow. Thanks to you both, Kathryn and Pete. It's been a really interesting discussion. And thanks for everybody for your really good and thoughtful questions. The show will be available in all the usual places on demand on the NATS YouTube channel in a few days, as well as an audio version wherever you happen to get your podcast. Keep an eye out on our NATS social media channels for details of the next show. And if you've got any great ideas about suggestions and topics and questions, then please just let us know. But for now, thank you very much and goodbye.